Divine Hiddenness is a topic that came up at a philosophy of religion conference I was at over in the UK recently. Several papers of the course of the 3-day conference were dedicated to this topic, and I have literally written nothing on this topic. So, so this unscripted video reflection here is going to be just some of my thoughts on the idea of divine hiddenness and maybe just some personal reflections. Maybe this is less philosophically astute here than the academic paper that I presented myself. So, look, I don't see divine hiddenness as a problem. So I just don't. I think that I understand why some people might think it's a problem for theistic belief. But I just don't see it. Maybe I don't feel it, right? As a Christian, someone who's felt aware of God my entire life, and then as I've grown intellectually, come to see that there are good reasons to believe, philosophical reasons to believe in God, good arguments for the existence of God and for Christian theism. It's hard to wrap my mind around the idea that someone could think that God is hidden. I think about scripture on this, and I think, I was trying to look up some verses from like the Psalms, and there are passages where David in the Psalms will say things like, God, why are you hiding your face from me? But notice the language there. I think he's not saying, I can't believe that God exists because God is hidden. He knows God exists, but he's wondering about the absence of that relationship with God. But that's not quite what divine hiddenness is in the philosophical literature as it was presented to me through these academic papers that I listened to. And again, I've done no writing on this, so I can't give you an argument off the top of my head. This is just unscripted reflections here on this. But I take it that from scripture, two things at least, three maybe. The heavens declare the glory of God. So suppose that's true, and I think it is true. How can God be hidden? If that's true, how can God be hidden? The creation tells us things about God's invisible attributes. Right? It says St. Paul in the book of Romans. If that's true, suppose that's true, and I think it is true. It is true. How can God be hidden? When Jesus himself says, seek, knock, ask, right? How can God be hidden? If Jesus, because Jesus rose from the dead and did so publicly with many witnesses, how can God be hidden? If Jesus is who he said he was, and if Jesus rose from the dead, God is not hidden. I just deny that God is hidden, I guess, both from my own experience and from scripture and maybe from philosophy as well. The pagan philosophers, Plato and Aristotle, just those two, they had a kind of thin theism, maybe not so thin, depending on how you read them. Plato thought that the good was just something that could be grasped by any intellect that wanted to look into it. You follow the path out of the cave, and the last thing you see is the sun, the good, right? Through a process of clear abstract reasoning, up from basic training in the physical, in gymnastics and in music, poetry and gymnastics, gymnastics for the body and poetry for the soul. And then on up through mathematics and geometry and music and astronomy and ultimately the dialectic, which leads someone to an ability to see the good, which is the highest thing. So God is not hidden. God was not hidden to the ancient pagan philosophers, nor the to the Gentile nations. God was not hidden to the people of Israel, and God initiated with us from the beginning with Adam. Right. So the thing that apparently in this discussion, the literature on this is motivated. I can't remember I'm going to get the guy's name wrong. There's a philosopher who's kind of the main interlocutor with Christian theists on this, who apparently claims that the mere existence of non-resistant non-believers entails either that God doesn't exist or the absence of good reasons to think that God exists, or as a defeater for good reasons to think that God exists. I'm not sure which of those it is. Might be all three. But let me just say something before we get into like my reflections on this. Just the very idea that an epistemic state in me, or a volitional state in me, and I'll take the non-resistant to be a volitional state. If I'm non-resisting, it involves my will. My will is not antagonistic or directed against the relationship or the beliefs, probably belief in this literature. My will is not resisting belief that P. Okay, so let's just put it that way. And yet I don't believe that P. So whether it's it seems to me the existence, if there is such a thing as a non-resistant non-believer in theism, in God, that involves a volitional state and an intellectual state. So the belief that P and the volitional attitude towards P. Okay, let's just assume that for a second. So here's my first question. How in the world does a volitional state or an epistemic state, a noetic state, let's put it that way, how in the world does my epistemology and my volition bear on the existence of something? And the answer is not at all. There's a famous line, don't immanentize the eschaton, right? I think, who said that? Was it Vogelin, maybe? Eric Vogelin? Or was it Rothbard? I can't remember. It was one of these political economic thinkers. It was probably Rothbard. Don't immanentize the eschaton. That means don't try and bring about now, here and now, the future heaven. Right? Don't try and put heaven on earth, kind of thing. Well, here's a riff on this. Someone's probably published this already, but don't epistemize the ontic. In other words, you can't make something not exist by disbelieving it. You can't make something not exist by not having a volitional attitude towards that thing or the proposition about that thing. Just try it. I mean, if you can, that's awesome. If you can, by disbelieving or not believing or rejecting all the evidence for or not thinking there's sufficient evidence for a bill that you have, your credit card bill, I'm a non-resistant non-believer about my credit card bill. And because I'm a non-resistant non-believer, that means that there's no good reason to think that I have a credit card bill. Well, if you can do that, okay. If it's just epistemic to epistemic, right? If my non-resistant non-belief is directed towards the evidence or the disbelief of the thing in question, okay. But look, if I literally mean my non-resistant non-belief entails the non-existence of an object, man, if you can do that, that's awesome, because we'll get rid of all our debt immediately. Forget Dave Ramsey. And the, what is this, baby steps, right? Dave Ramsey's baby steps to get you out of debt. No, all you can just do is have a non-resistant non-belief propositional epistemic attitude towards your debt, and bam, you're out of debt. There's no debt. It doesn't exist. Now, look, I don't think, and like I said, I haven't read the literature on this, but I don't think the existence of non-resistant non-believers is supposed to be epistemic to ontic, right? It doesn't mean that just because you disbelieve just because you have no belief or that you have no volitional resistance towards the content of the belief in question, that logically entails or somehow metaphysically brings about the non-existence of the thing. I don't think that's, hopefully not. I mean, if that's what this literature is about, then it's obviously false. Okay, so probably the existence of the existence of non-resistant non-believers. If I were a non-resistant non-believer, apparently that's supposed to show, I don't know, that the evidence against theism is no good. But again, I don't see how that's the case. I mean, if I'm a non-resistant non-believer, just use my credit card debt. I don't have any credit card debt, but Dave Ramsey might be watching this, so just so you know, Mr. Ramsey, I have no credit card debt. Don't need to talk about any other debt. Let's just focus on credit card debt. So if I have non-resistant non-belief towards the putative claim that I owe Visa $10,000, and I say, well, if there were really good evidence for the claim that I owe Visa $10,000, then of course I'd believe it. But look, I'm non-resistant to it, the evidence, and yet I don't have the belief. And that the existence of that state of affairs is supposed to count against the evidence? That doesn't seem right either. I mean, evidence for a proposition is states of affairs or facts that are point to the existence, the existential reality in question. So if I have evidence, that evidence is about, it's about certain state of affairs that lend credence to, give epistemic support for the existence of something else. So again, just because I have a state of affairs in me, in other words, whatever state of affairs that are in me, non-resistant non-belief in this case, those are about me, not about the quality of evidence. In other words, quality of evidence is irrelevant to the state of affairs of a knower. So again, I just don't see how that part of non-resistant non-belief entails the absence of the quality of evidence. So maybe non-resistant non-belief, the existence of such states in persons, is supposed to say something about the evidence itself. Or in other words, like, okay, so you stack up all the evidence for theism, and then you look over here and you see, oh, well, there's non-resistant non-believers. Therefore, that means I'm justified in my non-belief, or someone else is justified in their non-belief. But then I think, well, suppose you have good reason to explain non-resistant non-belief. Then that would count against that evidence as counter evidence for theistic evidence. So probably that's the dialectic there. But again, so I suppose you could just try and give psychological reasons for the existence of non-resistant non-belief, or I think better, probably show the incoherence of the concept of non-resistant non-belief. And I'm sure there's literature on this, and I'm just ignorant of it, but that's the way I would probably pursue this. If I were to make this an area of study, an area of inquiry, that's probably the way I would do it. I would just say, look, the very idea of non-resistant non-belief is somehow incoherent in itself. The reason for that is I think the epistemic state of non-belief is directly connected to the will. And this is, I think, a point that William James makes, and maybe in his will to believe is an important point, that I can have a belief state that I disbelieve. So a state of disbelief is, I think, necessarily connected to my volitional state. so that if in any state of disbelief, I am resisting believing that P. So let me put it this way. If I believe not P, or if I disbelieve P, so I might, maybe those are two different things, probably need to cash that out a little bit, make some distinctions there. There may be a distinction between disbelieving P and believing not P. Okay, so let's grant that. So I guess in the state of the theistic belief, let's just go with the first one. If I disbelieve P, if I disbelieve P, not that I believe not P, but I disbelieve P, so where P here is the proposition that God exists. If I don't believe that God exists, right, what I am resisting is the belief that God exists, right? So I think that disbelief, I would want to say maybe something like this. I don't know if this is right, but this is probably the way I do it. I'd want to say that necessarily any state of disbelief is resistant of that. The content is volitionally resistant to that belief state. So that necessarily if I disbelieve that P, I am resisting that P. Whether or not I can disengage my will from my beliefs seems like that's possible. But I think probably if I'm in a state of disbelief, that I'm also in a state of volitionally resisting that belief. And then maybe another way to get it, so I'd have to think about that one. That's I think the way I would do it. The other way to do it is I always hesitate to use James's will to believe in my approach to philosophy of religion because I'm opposed to pragmatism about truth. But in certain cases, and this is, I think, really important. So maybe I'll do a whole separate video reflection on this. But I think in the problem of divine hiddenness, what's hidden is a person. Putatively hidden is a person, I should say, right? And if I am non-resistant, right? Non-resistance is a bit vague, maybe a bit ambiguous. There's different ways to be non-resistant, right? But what non-resistant certainly is not is seeking, is trying to be finding, is an attempt to relate by volitional means to the object of belief. So William James's famous will to believe, this is not the place to get into this here, but I think can be used by an evidentialist, which I am, for theistic belief, because the object of belief is not a proposition that God exists. The object of belief is God himself, who is a person. And we can't approach persons in the same way we approach propositions. So if I'm not merely non-resistant to a person, why would I want to be friends with that person? Like, seriously, if someone's non-resistant to you, that's very different than them wanting to be your friend. And I say, well, why don't you hang out with so-and-so? Why don't you call up so-and-so? Why don't you text so-and-so and message them and hang out with them? They're non-resistant. Yeah, but why would I want to be friends with someone who's just non-resistant? I want to be friends with someone who wants to be friends with me. So I think probably the problem with divine hiddenness is because someone's non-resistant. Yeah, if God is if God is not apparent to you, it's because you're non-resistant. God, this is in the book of Hebrews, right? That God is a rewarder of those who come to God must believe that He exists. So if you're gonna be in that relationship with God, you have to believe that He exists, and there's good reasons to believe that. I mentioned that at the beginning of this unscripted video. Right? There's good reasons to believe that. If you want to be in a relationship with God, you must believe that He exists and that He's a rewarder of those who seek Him. Right? And that's more than just non-resistance. Let go of your non-resistance and seek the Lord while He still may be found. Thanks for watching.